This is not the first time Africa has had to fight for its place in the FIFA World Cup tournament. In fact, there was a time that Africa said, if you won't let us in on equal terms, we won't come at all. Yeah, and it changed everything. Let's go back, all the way back to 1964. To understand the boycott, you have to understand what FIFA looked like in the early 1960s. The World Cup was already the biggest sporting event on the planet. Nations fought for the right to qualify. The prestige was enormous. The exposure was life-changing for football federations and their players. And FIFA decided, in its infinite wisdom, that this global tournament would be allocated as follows: 10 spots for Europe, 4 for Latin America, 1 for Central America and the Caribbean, and for the entire combined regions of Africa, Asia, and Oceania. 3 continents, billions of people, dozens of nations, 1 spot, 1 between all of them. Now think about that for a moment. Europe, a continent which can fit into Africa 3 times, gets 10 spots. In Africa, Asia, and Oceania combined get 1 spot. Now layer on the political context, right? This is 1964. The wind of change has swept through Africa, or is sweeping through Africa. 17 African nations gained independence in 1960 alone. These were not invisible countries. These were sovereign nations standing on their own, building their own institution, demanding their place in the world order. And FIFA, led at the time by an Englishman named Stanley Roos, looked at this new Africa, this rising, independent, proud Africa, and said, you can share 1 spot with Asia and Oceania. Take it or leave it. My people, they left it. Yes. Now, every great act of resistance has an architect. And the architect of the 1966 boycott was Ghana. More specifically, it was Kwame Nkrumah. Ghana's first president, Pan-Africanist, visionary, the man who stood at independence in 1957 and told the world that the liberation of Ghana was meaningless unless it was linked to the total liberation of Africa. Nkrumah understood something that many people miss. He understood that sports was politics, that the football pitch was a stage, that if Africa could not compete equally in the world's biggest tournament, it was not just a football injustice, it was a political statement about how the world valued Africa. So he gave his instructions to Ohene John, head of Ghana's Central Organization of Sports, and a member of the Confederation of African Football. And the instructions were very clear. Do whatever is necessary to put African football on the international stage. And John, well, he got to work. In February 1964, the Confederation of African Football sent a formal letter to FIFA. And I want you to hear the language because it is precise, it is dignified, and it is firm. Quote, we limit our demand in the name of fair play and equity for 1 place of finalists to be granted to Africa. In the absence of this necessary adjustment, African associations cannot participate in the World Cup Jules Rimet Championship, 1966. Listen to that again. They said, we're limiting our demand. We are not asking for the world, right? We're asking for just 1 seat, 1 guaranteed seat for an entire continent. And FIFA said no. They said no. And here's where it gets even more complicated and more revealing. Because FIFA's response to Africa's demand was not just a flat refusal, it was also deeply revealing about whose interests FIFA was actually protecting. You see, at the time, apartheid South Africa was still a FIFA member, a country whose government had legalized racial segregation into law, a country that had banned its own black citizens from competing in integrated sport, a country that the rest of Africa and much of the world had declared a pariah. And FIFA's solution, to the problem of how to fit South Africa into the qualifying structure was to place them in an Asian qualifying group to avoid the optics of African nations having to play apartheid South Africa directly. Oh, can't make it up. You cannot make it up. FIFA was willing to bend the rules of geography, moving a Southern African nation into an Asian group to protect apartheid South Africa's participation. But they were not willing to give the entire African continent one guaranteed spot. That is who was running world football in 1964. Stanley Rouse, FIFA's president, was a product of the English football establishment, an establishment that had long viewed itself as the home of football, the rightful steward of the game. The idea that Africa, Asia, and Oceania deserved equal representation was simply not part of his worldview. And newly independent African nations, they saw it clearly. This was not just about football slots. This was about whether Africa would be allowed to exist as an equal on the world stage, or whether it would always be an afterthought, always sharing a seat, always fighting for scraps at a table that it held dear. So, what happened? 8 months passed after COP's letter, 8 months of silence from FIFA, 8 months of what activists call steady inaction. The strategy of ignoring a demand in the hope that the people making it will eventually give up and disappear, go away. But Africa did not go away. In July 1964, COP made it official. The decision was taken that Africa would boycott the 1966 World Cup qualifying rounds entirely, unless FIFA guaranteed Africa its own dedicated place. And in October 1964, after FIFA still did not move, COP confirmed it. Yes, all 15 eligible African teams, every single one, would not participate. Asia also largely joined them, with the notable exception of North Korea, who went on to have one of the most extraordinary World Cup runs in history, reaching the quarterfinals and just stunning the world. But that is a story for another episode. Okay. The point is that the 1966 World Cup in England went ahead without the African continent. Every African nation gone in unison, by choice. By choice. They walked away because they felt they weren't being treated fairly. That was unprecedented. No continent had ever done this before, and none has done it since. Think about that. Think about what that required. This was not one country making a principled stand, right? This was 15 nations with different governments, different politics, different football federations agreeing to sacrifice their own players' dream of playing on the world stage, agreeing to absorb the cost of non-participation, agreeing to stand together and say, not like this, not like this. That is elective power. That is what Pan-Africanism looks like in practice. And in Nkrumah's fingerprints, obviously we're all over it, his vision that African nations had to act as one, to be heard, was the engine behind the boycott. Ghana was its chief architect. but Africa was its body. And hearing this story, you can't help but ask difficult questions. What happened to that Africa?